Now, where have I seen her before? From How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. One of the great things about being a professor of English is that you get to keep meeting old friends. For beginning readers, though, every story may seem new and the resulting experience of reading is highly disjointed. Think of reading on one level as one of those papers from elementary school where you connect the dots. I could see the picture in a connect the dots drawing. I could never see the picture in the connect the dots drawing until I put in virtually every line. Other kids could look at a page full of dots and say, oh, that's an elephant, that's a locomotive. Me, I saw dots. I think it's partly predisposition. Some people handle two-dimensional visualization better than others, but largely a matter of practice. The more connect the dots drawings you do, the more likely you are to recognize the design early on. Same with literature. Part of pattern recognition is talent, but a whole lot of it is practice. If you read enough and give what you read enough thought and begin to see patterns, archetypes, and reoccurrences. And as with those pictures among the dots, it's a matter of learning to look. Not just to look, but where to look and how to look. Literature, as the great Canadian critic Northrop Frye observed, grows out of other literature. We should not be surprised to find then that it also looks like other literature. As you read, it may pay to remember this: there's no such thing as a wholly original work of literature. Once you know that, you can go looking for old friends and asking the attendant question. Now, where have I seen her before? One of my favorite novels is Tim O'Brien's Going After Cacassio. Lay readers and students generally like it too, which explains why it has become a perennial strong seller. Although the violence of the Vietnam War scenes may turn some readers off, many find themselves totally engrossed by something they initially figured would just be gross. What readers sometimes don't notice in their involvement with the story, and it is a great story, is that virtually everything in there is cribbed from somewhere else. O'Brien provides us with a wonderful glimpse into the creative process, a view of how stories get written, and a big part of that process is that you can't create stories in a vacuum. Instead, the mind flashes bits and pieces of childhood experiences, past reading, every movie the writer/creator has ever seen, last week's argument with the phone solicitor, in short, everything that lurks in the recesses of the mind. Some of this may be unconscious, as it is in the case of O'Brien's protagonist. Generally, though, writers use prior text quite consciously and purposefully, as O'Brien himself does. Unlike Paul Berlin, he is aware that he's drawing from Lewis Carroll or Ernest Hemingway. O'Brien signals the difference between novelist and character in the structuring of the two narrative frames. About halfway through the novel, O'Brien has his characters fall through a hole in the road. Not only that, one of the characters subsequently says that the way to get out is to fall back up. When it's stated this boldly, you automatically think of Lewis Carroll. Falling through a hole is like Alice in Wonderland. Bingo! It's all we need. In the world the squad discovers below the road, the network of Viet Cong tunnels, although nothing like the real ones, complete with an officer condemned to stay there for his crimes, is every bit as much an alternative world as the one Alice encounters in her adventure. Once you've established that a book, a man's book at that, a war book, is borrowing a situation from Lewis Carroll's Alice books, anything is possible. So with that in mind, readers must consider character situations and events in the novel. Sarkin Ong Wan is Paul Berlin's love interest, his fantasy girl. She is Vietnamese and knows about tunnels, but is not Viet Cong. She's old enough to be attractive, yet not old enough to make sexual demands on the virginal young soldier. She's not a real character, since she comes in after the start of the Berlin fantasy. Careful readers will find her real model in a young girl with the same hoop earrings when the soldiers frisk villagers in the remembered war scene. Fair enough, but that's just the physical person, not her character. Then who is she? Where does she come from? Think generically. Lose the personal details, consider her as a type, and try to think where you've seen that type before. A brown-skinned young woman guiding a group of white men, mostly white anyway, speaking the language they don't know, knowing where to go, where to find food, taking them west. Right. No, not Pocahontas. She never led anyone anywhere, whatever the popular culture may suggest. Somehow Pocahontas has received better PR, but we want the other one, Sacagawea. If I need to be guided across hostile territory, she's the one I want, and she's the one Paul Berlin wants too. He needs a figure who will be sympathetic, understanding, strong in the ways he's not, and most of all, successful in bringing him safely to his goal of getting to Paris. O'Brien plays here with the reader's established knowledge of history, culture, and literature. He's hoping that your mind will associate Sarkin Ong Wan consciously or unconsciously with Sacagawea, thereby not only creating her personality and impact, but also establishing the nature and depth of Paul Berlin's need. If you require a Sacagawea, you're really lost. The point isn't really which native woman figures in O'Brien's novel, it's that there is a literary or historical model that found her way into his fiction to give it shape and purpose. He could have used Tolkien rather than Carroll, and while the surface features would have been sufficient, the principle would have remained the same. Although the story would go in different directions with the change of literary model, in either case it gains a kind of a resonance from those different levels of narrative that begin to emerge. The story is no longer all on the surface, but begins to have depth. What we're trying to do is to learn to read with the sort of thing like a wily old professor, to learn to spot those familiar images, like being able to see the elephant before we connect the dots. You say stories grow out of other stories, but Sacagawea was real. As a matter of fact, she was. But from our point of view, it doesn't really matter. History is story too, so you don't encounter her directly, you've only heard of her through narrative of one sort or another. She is a literary as well as a historical character, as much of a piece of American myth as Huck Finn or Jay Gatsby, and very nearly as unreal. And what all this is about, finally, is myth, which brings us to the big secret. Here it is. There's only one story. There, I said it. And I can't very well take it back. There's only one story, ever, one. It's always been going on, and it's everywhere around us, and every story you've ever read or heard or watched is part of it. All this resembles other literature is all well and good, but what does it mean for our reading? Excellent question. If you see the reference, it means nothing, right? So the worst thing that occurs is that we're still reading the same story as if the literary precursors weren't there. From there, anything that happens is bonus. A small part of what transpires is what I call the aha factor, the delight we feel at recognizing a familiar component from earlier experience. That moment of pleasure, wonderful as it is not enough, so that awareness of similarity leads us forward. What typically takes place is that we recognize elements from some prior text and begin drawing comparisons and parallels that may be fantastic, parodic, tragic, or anything. Once that happens, our reading of the text changes from the reading governed by what is overtly on the page. This dialogue between old text and new is always going on at one level or another. Critics speak of this dialogue as intertextuality, the ongoing interaction between poems and stories. This intertextual dialogue deepens and enriches the reading experience, bringing multiple layers of meaning to the text, some of which readers may not even consciously notice. The more we become aware of the possibility that our text is speaking to other texts, the more similarities and correspondences we begin to notice, and the more alive the text becomes. We'll come back to this discussion later, but for now, we'll simply note that newer works are having a dialogue with older ones, and they often indicate the presence of this conversation by invoking the older text with anything from oblique references to extensive quotations. But what do we do if we don't see all the correspondences? First of all, don't worry. If a story is no good, being based on Hamlet won't save it. The characters have to have characters as themselves. The characters have to work as characters as themselves. Sarkin Ong Wong needs to be a great character, which she is, before we need to worry about her resemblance to a famous character of our acquaintance. If the story is good and the characters work, but you don't catch allusions and references and parallels, then you've done nothing worse than read a good story about memorable characters. If you begin to pick up on some of these other elements, these parallels and analogies, however, you'll find your understanding of the novel deepens and becomes more meaningful, more complex. But we haven't read everything. Neither have I, nor has anyone, not even Harold Bloom. Beginning readers, of course, are at a slight disadvantage, which is why professors are useful in providing a broader context. But you definitely can't get there on your own. When I was a kid, I used to go mushroom hunting with my father. I would never see them, but he'd say, "There's a yellow sponge," or "There are a couple of black spikes." And because I knew they were there, my looking would become more focused and less vague. In a few moments, I would begin seeing them myself. Not all of them, but some. And once you begin seeing more else, you can't stop. What a literature professor does is very similar. He tells you when you get near the mushrooms. Once you know that, though, and you generally are near them, you can hunt for mushrooms on your own.